Welcome back to another episode of Written for Our Admonition. We're still continuing our study in the Old Testament, and we're picking up where we left off about 2 weeks ago, discussing Moses. We had intended for this week to be the second week that we were discussing Moses, with next week being the final time that we were talking about him, at least for our dedicated conversations about Moses. Of course, I had some things come up in my personal life with work that interfered with that, so unfortunately we had to delay some of these episodes, but we're ready to get back into the swing of things, and hopefully things will be on track from this point forward, of course, with this episode being delayed this week. But we are talking about Moses, as I mentioned, and whether we realize it or not, what we talked about in our previous conversation about Joseph and really focusing on him and his role in bringing the Israelites into the land of Egypt factors in heavily when we talk about Moses. Because we have to realize the story of Moses begins really back in the time of Joseph and the patriarchs, because we're going to find that Moses and Egypt are inextricably linked. And we'll talk more about what I mean by that a little bit later here once we get into the swing of the discussion. But we want to start off in the land of Egypt, and want to just briefly review that gap of time between the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus. Now, the Bible and these particular books are not labeled as far as their timestamps. It's not as though Moses, when he was writing these books, wrote down this happened in the year 4000 BC. But we know that these books happen in those time periods. We know that they happen around the 1500 BC time period. There's evidence in archaeology that shows that to us. But we also know that these things are not timestamps, so the point that I'm making is, when you go from Genesis into Exodus, you're dealing with a large gap of time. You're dealing with possibly 300 to 400 years of history that's unfolded between the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and the time of Moses here, starting in Exodus chapter 1. So knowing that gap of time helps us to understand how the state of affairs has so radically changed. Because we see here, as I have on the slide, that the descendants of Abraham remained in Egypt. They didn't go anywhere. They didn't return to the land of Canaan. They didn't go back to Babylon. They remained in Egypt. And it was a good arrangement for them for many, many years. It was a mutually beneficial situation for the Egyptians and for the Israelites, or the Hebrews, as we'll see them referred to throughout the body of Exodus. So we see this is an arrangement that helped both of these peoples. But there was going to come a time when it was no longer seen as helpful by the leadership of Egypt. So let's go ahead and just look at the scriptures here and understand what's taking place in the land of Egypt. I'm going to go ahead and bring up our text here, and that's in Exodus chapter 1. And I'm going to look at verses 7 through 10 here. I had them as separate passages on our slide, but we'll look at these together and understand the situation as it took place around the time of Moses. So starting in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 7, we read this. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen, in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. So what's happening here in these three verses? So verse 7 repeats what we've already mentioned. The Israelites stayed in the land of Egypt. They multiplied and increased exceedingly. They were overflowing in the land, you might say. So there are a significant population in the land of Egypt. There's a ton of them. There are some estimates that would say that there were between 2 to 3 million of them by the time they left Egypt, so you can kind of imagine where they might have been at this time, where it may not have been to that extent, but they're definitely a large group of people in this land. This is not insignificant. And then we see in verses 8 through 10 how the new Pharaoh, the new king, as he's referred to there in verse 8, did not know Joseph. He was not aware of what came before him, and so he's looking at things now and realizing that if these people turn against us, we're going to be in trouble. Look at how mighty they are. Look at how numerous they are. If an enemy invades the land of Egypt and they decide to join up with this enemy, basically the Pharaoh thought, we're toast. We have no options. And so the idea the Pharaoh has here is to deal shrewdly with the Israelites, which is incidentally going to backfire on him pretty tremendously. But his idea is that we want to deal shrewdly with them and burden them so that if they choose this, they're going to regret it. That's his basic idea. He wants to get as much out of them as he possibly can. He wants to burden them. He wants to put them under certain restrictions to keep them from becoming any stronger than they already are, because he was threatened by them. And so we're seeing here already at the start of the book of Exodus, a problem is emerging. Now, I'll point out to you something that we discussed a few weeks ago when we talked about Abraham. This was something God said would happen back in Genesis chapter 15. He was talking about what we're reading here in Exodus chapter 1. He had mentioned to Abram before he was named Abraham that the descendants that he would have, that God would give to him, would serve a fierce nation, and they would do that for hundreds of years. They would be doing that, and they would be suffering greatly, but there would come a time that he would deliver them. And now that time is about to dawn. So this is the background when we talk about Moses. This is what we're referring to when we talk about his situation into which he was born. This is where he was raised up and the situation he was aware of. So he might have been aware of a time from the past anyway, that Egypt was a place of refuge. In fact, all the Israelites would have seen Egypt that way. Because remember, once again, it was through Joseph, who had become second in command in Egypt, that the children of Israel, or specifically Jacob and his children and his grandchildren and so forth, were delivered from famine. And they were brought down to the land of Egypt, and they were able to survive and then become thriving people in that land. So we see then it was a place of refuge, but now look what it's become. It's a place of enslavement. It's a place of desolation. It is not a place they want to remain, in other words. And so Pharaoh is going to order some hard labor here. We've already mentioned that, but the other item he's going to mention is the fact that there are no male children to be born to the Hebrews or to the Israelites. The Pharaoh has this idea that if we can destroy the male children, that will reduce their capacity to make war against us. That was their perspective at that time, and that's how Pharaoh was going to approach this. It was an evil order. It never should have been said. But it's what Pharaoh decided to do because he thought in his calculations, not thinking one thought about God or what is right, but in his calculations about his own national interest, he thought this is the way things ought to go. We've got to destroy these male children. That'll make the Israelites weak. We'll be able to subdue them if anything happens. And again, as I mentioned already, it's going to backfire on him tremendously. But against all of this, we've already mentioned his name, Moses, is going to be born into this situation. And he's going to come in a way that we would not expect. He does not seem to be from a significant family. He does not seem to be a significant person. And yet through God and his great power, we're going to see just how mighty Moses becomes. So let's turn our attention now over to our next slide here. And we're going to see how the infant Moses had to be given up by his mother. And we're going to read that in Exodus chapter 2 in a moment to understand what took place there. But also how Moses was actually himself delivered by the daughter of Pharaoh. So again, there's some interesting events that are taking place here that could easily be deemed to be coincidental, but most certainly are not a coincidence. Let's get back into the text. I'm going to look here at Exodus chapter 2. And in Exodus chapter 2 here, we're going to read verses 1 through 10. We'll just go ahead and put these all together and understand the early part of Moses' life. And a man of the house of Levi went and took his wife, a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off, to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." So there's a lot said in those 10 verses, but it tells us right away what the situation was with Moses. So we see that he is born to two Levites there in verse 1. It says, a man of the house of Levi took as wife a daughter of Levi. So we see that he is from the tribe of Levi in that case. And we also see that in verse 3, that his mother had hid him. Because again, we saw the order of Pharaoh back in chapter 1 was that all the male children were to be put to death. Well, his mother hid him for that reason. She did not want him to fall prey to that. So she hid him, but when she knew she could no longer do that, she decided to put him into an ark of bulrushes or a little basket, place him in that situation, put him out by the river, and hopefully something would come about that would preserve him from death. And that's exactly what happened. We see Pharaoh's daughter in verse 5 of chapter 2 here in Exodus. She just so happened to be bathing in the river at that time. And she just so happened to notice, along with her maidens, that there was this little basket coming toward them. And she just so happened to order them to check on it. And it just so happened that Moses' sister was there, Miriam, who also had some things to say. So a lot of coincidence, again, seeing in this text. And yet, once more, we realize this is not coincidental. This is God orchestrating this situation. It may not make sense to us yet, but we're going to see how it all comes together with how Moses is going to be in his life and what God is going to have him to do. Now, after Exodus chapter 2 and verse 10, where we read about his infancy and how he was delivered from death and all of this, there's another jump in time. So verse 11 on down to the end of chapter 2, you're jumping in time by about 40 years. You're looking at him now, he's a grown man. He's living his life. He's been in Egypt for many years now. He's been raised up as a son in the Pharaoh's household. And then he goes out, in verse 11, it talks about how he sees one of his Hebrew brethren being beaten by an Egyptian. He kills the Egyptian, and when he realizes this has been found out, that people are aware of this, he flees into the land of Midian because he knew that he would be put to death if he were discovered and there were evidence brought against him. So he's going to go to the land of Midian. He's going to remain there for many years. He's going to marry into the Midianite families. He's going to have children there. He's going to work for his father-in-law Jethro. He's going to put down roots in the land of Midian. And so going back to our slideshow here, we see that through all of this, it really seems like Moses' story has already ended. There really doesn't seem to be much left here. It seems like it's ended before it ever began, but again, God has other plans here. He had other plans for what would take place with his infancy and his birth and his life at the early point there. We saw that it very well could have gone the direction that he was put to death, that an unjust order from Pharaoh was executed and he would have been put to death along with other children. But that was not God's will. God's will was for him to be preserved, for him to be protected, for him to be raised up for that purpose. And we're going to see how this unfolds a little bit later here, going into Exodus chapter 3, where again we see another time jump of another 40 years or so that unfold here. And we're going to read about how now Moses is an older man, about 80 years old, and he's going to be in the land of Midian, and he's going to be up on a mountain doing his shepherdly duties. And we're going to find in that situation how he is going to have an appearance from God and how all this is going to unfold as far as his call goes. And this is really where we begin to see him become a deliverer, because that is what God is going to call him to do. So going over to our next slide here, we get oriented around this idea of the burning bush. I'm sure if you're listening to this and you've read the scriptures before, you know about the burning bush. But let's talk in further detail about what actually happens here and why this is so significant. Why this is not something just to read and kind of brush aside. This really is an important idea to consider and realize just how important this would have been to Moses and to the children of Israel in general, especially as they look back on this in their history. So once more, we're going to get back into the text, and I'm going to invite you to join me in Exodus chapter 3, and we're going to be in Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 4 to get us started here. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Let's pause right there for a moment. So again, this is a normal circumstance as far as what verse 1 says. So Moses is tending to his father-in-law's flock. He was a shepherd. He's out there doing his shepherdly duties. And he leads the flock to the back of the desert. He comes to Horeb, the mountain of God. And it's there he's going to have an appearance from the Lord in the midst of this burning bush. It's going to be a significant appearance. Now, why does this actually matter so much? Well, for one thing, we need to realize that this is probably the first time that someone has spoken with the Lord in this situation, in this context, for a long time. Now, we don't know for sure if there were other people who interacted with God in the way that we see in the book of Genesis, like with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and so forth, but most certainly this would have stood out. This would have been pretty unique. And this is most certainly a divine commission that God had for Moses. And it's shown by the fact that there is a miraculous event associated with this, where there is an appearance here in verses 3 through 4. Where Moses sees this great sight, he refers to it as this burning bush, and he beholds this and realizes there's something odd about that. It's not a normal situation to see a burning bush that's never consumed. That's unusual. That is supernatural. The laws of nature have been suspended for this. That is going to lead in verse 4 to where the Lord will tell to Moses or call out to Moses and have him listen to his message he has for him. Again, it's that divine calling. So we have the significance of it thusly, where it has been a long while since something like this has happened, where someone has spoken to the Lord in this manner, but then also we see there's a miraculous event associated with this to really confirm that this is a divine event, a divine calling. Moses was not out there and hearing voices. Moses was not out there and hallucinating because it was so hot. He is out here and he hears the voice of the Lord, and he has this experience, and it most certainly is legitimate, and what comes afterward is going to confirm this. Let's go ahead and read on down to verses 5 through 10. Let's see what the Lord has to say to Moses. What is it that God wants Moses to do, in other words? Well, let's start reading in verse 5. Then he said, "Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground." Moreover, he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, "I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and a large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." A lot of significant details there. Time forbids us to dig into every facet of why this is significant. We've already done a little bit more talking about the burning bush there, but this calling from God, this commission that God has for Moses, really stands out in a very special way. So for one thing, in verse 5, we probably know about this already, about taking your sandals off your feet because where you stand is holy ground. Well, it's not necessarily that the mountain itself was itself holy. It's not as though in and of itself that dirt on that mountain was holy, but it's rather because of the divine appearance that's taking place here, which confirms to Moses that this is indeed a divine calling. So again, all these details come together to show us this was a legitimate calling of God, a legitimate divine occurrence. So all that being said, let's focus on the message that God has for Moses here in verses 6 through 10. So he first identifies himself as the God of your father, specifically the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So he's calling to Moses and telling him in clear terms that the God that you knew Abraham served, the God that you knew Isaac served, and the God that you knew Jacob served, I am that same God. I have not changed. I have not forgotten you. I still have those covenants in mind. All of that is still valid and active. So that's what's intended to be reminded here to Moses, for him to call to mind what he would have known from the past and what was given down to him through the traditions he would have been aware of. So verses 7 through 9 here, we see how God is aware of the suffering of the Israelites in Egypt. He says in verse 7, "I have surely seen the oppression of my people. I've heard their cries. I know their sorrows." And he says in verse 8, "I'm ready to deliver them. And not only am I ready to deliver them, I'm ready to bring them into the land that I promised them. I am ready to give to them the land of the Canaanites. I am ready to show them what I have laid by in store for them all these years." And he says in verse 9, reaffirming there, that cry of the Israelites has come to me. I've seen this oppression. I am ready to take action. Now here's where verse 10 comes in. "I will send you, Moses. You are going to be the instrument of deliverance. You're going to be the one who's going to take these people of Israel and get them out of Egypt. You're going to be the one that's going to confront the Pharaoh. You're going to be the one that ushers all this before you, because I'm going to be the one helping you." Well, we probably know from reading chapters 3 and 4 of Exodus that initially Moses is very hesitant. And in fact, he gets to the point in chapter 4 where he basically just says, "Lord, just pick anybody else." He's saying very clearly he does not want to do it. He has no interest in it. It's not for him. He's not a leader. The issue is settled with Moses as far as he is concerned, but the Lord is insistent, telling Moses that this is his calling. This is what God wants him to do. He has commanded him. He's given him every resource he's going to need to make this happen. So God is calling Moses to be a deliverer. Now, I want to make something clear. It's not as though Moses in and of himself had the power to deliver anybody. Moses did not have that power. In fact, really no one has that power in and of themselves. But it's God empowering people to do this, and especially empowering someone like Moses. Think for just a moment about the excuses that he makes. I know we're not talking about them in great detail here, but just the fact that he made the excuses in the first place. The fact that he felt the need to actually say to the Lord, just pick someone else. He was a humble person. And humble, not just in the sense of having a low sense of self, but also humble and looking to the needs of others. So he definitely had that going on, but man, he really was a humble guy, almost to the point that it led him to really not see himself as a leader at all, to really not see himself the way that God saw him. And that really became a bit of a hindrance to him. He really comes off as somewhat weak in this situation and really doesn't seem to understand that the Lord is able to overcome these obstacles that Moses is putting up. But it really came down to the fact that Moses just didn't want to do it. But again, we see that through a weakness like that, and through the hesitancy of Moses, and through his humility in this situation, his lack of leadership skills, that makes the power of God shine forth even more. I've got to admit that's not a point that's original to me by any means, but I believe it's an important one to understand why God would choose someone like Moses. I mean, why not move on to the next person who wouldn't make excuses? Why not move on to the next person who definitely has more skills to do this? I mean, here Moses is, he's a shepherd in the middle of nowhere, and you're going to choose him to deliver Israel? I mean, surely you'd want some type of kingly figure, some type of person who's mighty and powerful and hulking. You'd think that's the one that you choose to deliver your people. That's not how God operates. And we've already seen this if we go back to the book of Genesis. God choosing people that you would not expect, people who are weak, people who are filled with issues, who have a lot of baggage, and yet God is able to empower them to carry out his work. Because fundamentally, as we're already learning from Genesis and Exodus here, it's not about the person himself or herself. It's about God who's able to work through them and accomplish great things on their behalf and through them. So it's not about them per se, but it's about what God is able to do. And the weaker the person is, and the lower strength they have, the more then God's power and God's strength comes through even more clearly. So having discussed all of that, we understand that Moses is being set up as the deliverer. That's God's intention for him. He wants him to go out and to do this. And he's going to go forth to Pharaoh. He's going to do as God commanded, despite his hesitation, despite his lack of desire. He's going to do this. And he's going to confront the Pharaoh. He's going to go through the 10 plagues. He's going to pronounce them to Pharaoh and warn him and tell him very clearly, God is going to judge you and your people if you do not change your ways. If you do not let the children of Israel leave, this is going to happen to you. And just as Moses said it, that's exactly what happened. And just as Moses proclaimed it, it happened exactly the way that he said it, over and over and over again, until it finally reached the fever pitch in chapters 11 through 12 of Exodus. You have there the death of the firstborn in Egypt. What a tragedy that was. But it came about because the Pharaoh refused to change, and he refused to understand what was taking place. He was so insistent that things be his way, he couldn't see it any other way. So inevitably, as we proceed on through the book of Exodus here, we see that God will deliver Israel through Moses, that Moses will be the one to lead Israel out of Egypt with a mighty hand and outstretched arm, but again, not through his power, but rather through the power of God. Let's go back to the text here. So we're going to look back in Exodus chapter 14. I'm looking at verses 13 through 22 here. And let's just consider a little bit more about what's taking place here in Exodus chapter 14. I'm going to read verses 13 on down to about verse 23. So if you join me in that reading, we'll go ahead and discuss this. And Moses said to the people, Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. And the Lord said to Moses, Why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. But lift up your rod, and stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I indeed will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, and they shall follow them. So I will... I'm in verse 17 there. Let's go back to verse 18. Then the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gained honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the angel of God, who went before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. Thus it was a cloud and darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other, so that the one did not come near the other all that night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went in the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went after them in the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. To an extent, I don't know that there's much explanation to give there besides the situation itself. So we see that at the beginning of chapter 14, the Egyptians have pursued Israel. Israel has left Egypt, and the Pharaoh, along with his army, they go after them. They want to stop them. They want to bring them back. They do not want to allow them to escape. Now, again, the reasoning for that is they were their labor force. They did not want their labor force to dry up that way because it would have severe economic repercussions, and that's exactly what it did. But that's a conversation for a different time. But I want you to notice how Moses approaches this back up in verses 13 through 14. So Moses does not make this about himself. He is a deliverer, yes, but notice who he makes it about. Who does he say in verse 14 will fight for them? the Lord will fight for you. It's all about the Lord in Moses' mind. So again, we talked about why God would choose someone like Moses to do this. Well, let's start with the fact that Moses stood behind the Lord and let the Lord do what he does best. He realized that he did not have the power to deliver an entire nation of people. He realized he didn't have the ability to do any sort of great task like that, but with God's help, he most certainly could. And that's precisely what happens. We are very familiar with what takes place here, especially in verses 21 through 22. You have Moses stretching out his hand over the sea. The Lord causes the sea to go back. He causes that water to stand up on its sides on either side of the water there. He causes the people of Israel to pass through as on dry ground. That was God's effort on their behalf. That was his power to deliver them. But it came through the hand of Moses. It showed forth most vividly through his efforts. So Moses is a deliverer. That's how he's remembered in the Old Testament. That's how he's talked about in many of the passages we're going to look at a little bit later in the Psalms and the prophets, where Moses is looked at as that deliverer, as that redeemer, even though it was not about him himself, but rather about what God was able to do through him. So a very significant detail about Moses, a very important part of who he is as a person and who he was in his life. And it's going to be what makes him so significant in the history of Israel. But this is not the only aspect of Moses that we're going to consider, because when we think about Moses, there's a whole lot more to him than we can cover in one discussion. He's not just a deliverer, he's also a lawgiver, and he's also a prophet. So our next two discussions are going to focus on those roles of Moses, his role as prophet and his role as lawgiver, to understand how those come into play, and why that matters so much in the history of Israel, and specifically why it matters so much in our conversation about Moses. I hope this has enlightened you a little bit more about how Moses comes into play as a deliverer. I actually had an entire other slide here, but we're already way over time, so I'll go ahead and quit here, and we can resume our conversation next week, discussing how Moses is a lawgiver and how all of that matters, especially to our understanding of the Old Testament and even a little bit into the New Testament. As always, I thank you for your time. I hope this has been beneficial to you, and we'll talk again soon.